Hello, YouTube. Long time, no talk about world building. I built a world and I got tired and I have not, God rested on the seventh day and I rested way longer because I'm not God. Um, right. So you built a world too, I'm assuming, because y'all are fantasy writers, right? What do we do now? After you build a world, what do you do? How do you jam it in to a story? It's difficult. So I do a monthly critique stream where I read things submitted by patrons, and I've been thinking a lot about world building because I read a lot of different fantasy stories. But yeah, I thought it would be good to talk about how to blend things into your story. I broke it down into three main types of world building insert thing, whatever. But like there's your foundational, there's your plot relevant, and then there's flavor. And of course, a blurry line exists between all of these things because it always does. How annoying. Let's break this down. So the very first thing, what I find that gets forgotten is foundational world building. Foundational world building is your foundation. It's everything that your reader needs to know. It's the pamphlet, It's the travel pamphlet that your character needs in order to navigate the world that they're in. Some very simple things can escape you in foundational world building. When you're introducing your world, and all this foundation needs to happen at the very beginning sections of your story, within the introduction. And it's as simple as establishing, is this urban fantasy? Is this high fantasy? A lot of the times that is the simplest hurdle that I get tripped up on when I am reading fantasy stories. I messed it up in Pretty Mouth. I did not set up the world at all. And when you're doing a comic, it's actually really easy to do this. You just need to show the world a little bit, maybe a crowd scene, maybe a setting, whatever needs to happen to set up like what type of world this is. Is there magic? You don't want to get into like too much nitty gritty. You want it distilled. You want it super hacking distilled. Like 9 Points, it's a world of cats that hate calicos, and soul magic is a thing. I don't get into the details of how soul magic works. I get into the very, very basics of it just to kind of imply its depth without delving into it. But the biggest, most important thing in 9 Point is that it is a little fantasy kingdom with cats. And it also exists in a world where there are other animals who are also anthropomorphic, which also gets introduced very quickly within the first two scenes. It's establishing, it's foundational. So yeah, like level of tech is a good thing to establish, kind of like era, level of magic, just like your basic stuff. Like make sure that this is made priority, because a lot of the times it's easy to overlook this very basic stuff because you're so used to your world, but other people are not. Avo, the books of Avo, my other comic slash novel thing, we open with like the ancient story that was like 300 years in the past, talks about like elves and magic, and then we smash cut to the current story where Juliet is on a date, and it's very 1920s, whatever. So I'm recording this live on a live stream, and I am looking at chat at the moment. See, I'm narrating what I'm doing. Would cyberpunk setting technically be magic, but just by science? Science is just explained by magic, right? Yeah, there's a blurry line between like sci-fi and magic. Like if you're setting up a sci-fi world, it's very similar. Like there's science fantasy versus like hard science fiction, and you need to establish that same kind of thing. And if you're doing like a real world thing, like maybe you're not like world building. If you're just telling a story in another historical period, it's also important to set that up. You just have a higher bar to hit when you're creating an entirely new fantasy world. But the very basics, like what is integral to your story, that needs to happen early, and you need to think a lot more broad than you probably are. It's simple to do, but it's easy to forget, I guess, is what I would say about foundational world building. So the next one is plot relevant world building. And it's similar to foundational, but a lot more specific, a lot less broad. It gets into the nitty gritties of your magic systems. It gets into the nitty gritty of whatever systems like you are going to be interacting with. Like maybe you're really going to be focused on the economic system of your magical world, your fantasy world, or maybe the political system, or cultures, like the different like interactions between people. Like whatever is important, like that would be your plot relevance. That's your nitty gritty, and that is going to be continuous throughout. Typically what you want to do when you are letting people know about your cool world building and establishing concepts that are needed, you want to demonstrate them before they become important. You want to show, you want to tell, you want to do all of that. You really want to establish things before they are important, rather than bringing them up out of convenience when they're needed. Sometimes it can feel like you're doing that, like you're just bringing up something out of nowhere, but it's not the case. Sorry, how do I explain this? So let's say you have like a wizard or something, and you have a character and they're about to be, murdered or something, and the wizard saves them with like some crazy magic you've never seen. Like that is showing magic. That could be a way to introduce a new concept. It's okay if occasionally, like, the day gets saved, things get resolved with things we don't understand, as a way to set them up later when you want your readers to understand how it works. If that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. But if you want to build big plot points that feel satisfying, you want to let your readers in on things. You want them to be able to piece things together. You don't want them to be lost, usually. Sometimes you do, but for the most part, we don't want our readers to be lost. Yeah, so like setting up plot relevant information, it's important to distill it, really think about what actually needs to be understood, and what is just fluff, and repeat the integral stuff and add a little bit of fluff around it, but really iterate and repeat and really make explicit how things work before you get into your big climactic stuff, before you get into the stuff that really matters. I would say like after the midpoint, you don't want to be introducing integral bits of your magic system. You want maybe like fine-tuning bits, but you don't want everyone lost after the halfway point. You don't want to be pulling things out of nowhere at that point. And I think the final one, I think people do all right with this part. I think people maybe get a little bogged down, or they're missing the foundational stuff, so it's hard to understand it. It's like Chekhov's gun, except you have to explain how a gun works. Basically, you want to set like it's similar to Chekhov's gun, where you're putting it on the mantle, but it's Chekhov's exploding cupcake. I always go back to cupcakes. You got to explain that cupcakes just all explode in this world. It's you need to set up the laws of your universe. Yeah. And the final one, I find is probably the one that I think is most lacking. Not necessarily lacking, difficult. Yeah, the most difficult is flavor. And speaking of cupcakes, okay, I've been thinking about flavor a lot because I've talked about the concept of adding flavor, adding world building as flavor. And I think when I say that, it feels like we're adding spices to something. Like, I don't know, like you're mixing spices into something, right? Whatever. But like, we need to think it more like cakes, okay? Flavor is baked into your story. It's baked into your world. It's not sprinkled on top. It's not sprinkled throughout. It is baked in. It permeates all parts of your story. So when it comes to flavor, you really need to examine things a lot more in general. Like some basic flavor things. One of the most basic flavor things that always works, it's frustrating how well it works, is the by the gods thing. When people say by the gods instead of like by God, you know, like idioms, metaphors, expressions, like that's how you really can bake in your world. By the gods, that's what I did like in Avo because it works. It works so well. It's a very easy way to set up that, like, especially in like an alternative kind of era. Like in the books of Avo, it's like a 1920s inspired fantasy, but to like really set up that it's like not just like our world but fantasy. It's, you know, it's by the goddess, you know. But I don't think that's like the end all be all of it. That's like the most like simple, easy peasy way to do it. But like expressions like that work within your world, like those are kind of important to develop. You don't want them to be so out there that people don't understand what you're saying, but in a way that clues people into like the culture of your world, and in a way that, I don't know, is fun, it's flavor, it can be built upon later. Like oh goddess, like implies that we're gonna learn about some of the pantheon, which is very true in Avo's case. But yeah, I think when I'm seeing things that really need that flavor, that really need, not only does it help with like building your foundation, like it creates a more like immersive experience, it makes things feel more real. I think expressions and idioms are like the very first place to look, and you really need to get into the habit of thinking about your word choice, thinking about how things are phrased, but don't be pedantic about it too, because like you can become a total pedant about this stuff. Like when you get down to it, like you can't entirely flavor your world as another entirely different world than ours, because you need to be translating it so that people can read it, right? Alongside expressions and really looking into like your words and stuff, like, and not being pedantic, obviously, because like every word in the English language is going to come from somewhere. Every word exists within context, and people just will vary in how much they can tolerate. Like I use like a French word in Avo, like the first sentence in it is technically French, but like there's no French in Avo. It's just like, it's just common nomenclature within English to use de jour, right? But within the novel, it wouldn't make sense if you dig too deep. But you can do that with most words. So like there's a tolerance level, so just don't be pedantic. I think idioms and metaphors are probably a great place to at least draw some amount of line, because idioms are so on their face, and you can do a lot with an idiom, you know? Idioms, fun things to mess with. Creating expressions within your world that aren't just reskins of our expressions also is really cool. It's important to do that. Yeah, and alongside that, I think the even more important thing is to think about how people live within your world, how your characters live, and to find the fascinating mundane things. I think when you set up the magical mundane, you can really dig into a world in ways that you otherwise wouldn't, because you might be tempted to like have your characters do something kind of, I don't know, just what anyone else would do. What would you do? Because an example of the magical mundane would be like, what is normal for your character that wouldn't be normal for your reader? And using those as backdrops are great ways to like get into your world. Like I can think of things like religious ceremonies would be a good one. In Avo, a lot of like the historical fantasy elements are kind of meshed into like the world of Avo. So like the whole concept of flappers within the books of Avo, it takes a lot of inspiration from like dragons. So like with like the beaded dresses being very shiny and like dragon scale, and everyone's smoking all the time, like dragons. There's lots of like dragon scale stockings and things like that. Yeah. Which I guess is kind of magical mundane, because magical mundane doesn't even necessarily mean magic. It's about like your world. It's about world building as much as it is about magic systems. But like you kind of need to find that kind of stuff as backdrops, like those kind of activities and those kind of settings. Rather than doing something that wouldn't be different. Unless, of course, you're wanting to establish that something isn't different. Like, that's also fine. But if you're looking to really, like, delve into things, you want to, like, highlight the differences. And like, in the case with Avo, like, I'm also kind of setting up historical context, too. Because, like, obviously, like, some people don't know, well, historical things. But there you go. The point is that, like, world building, like, even if we slice it down into these things, like, we slice it down into the plot relevant and the foundational, like, it all coalesces, right? And you need to, like, just be thinking about it on all levels, and you need to think about it as a reader, and, like, what needs to be understood, what can be just, like, backdrop and interesting, and there's no third thing. It's just like what is needed and what creates an atmosphere. What makes the wiki article and what does the average person know, you know? Like that's kind of the breakdown of world building. Yeah, I'm sure I'll talk about world building another time. It is a huge topic and I can delve into any of these things. But I think that's all I need to say at the minute. I'm currently live streaming and I need live people to like the video, and I need non-live people. I need dead people to like my video. I want vampires and zombies, and I was gonna say werewolves, but like werewolves aren't dead, I don't think. Not in most world building. So, you know, if you consider yourself the undead, drop a like, a subscribe, and, you know, thank you. Thank you to all who did already. I am saying it way more than I would on stream otherwise, because I'm doing all these recordings and I'm being a good boy who YouTube's correctly. Please let me keep my channel. Thank you. I don't know how to end these things ever.